Guramahagat Lascan Corla, and I'm glad to contribute on this vitally important debate. The IPCC report in August warned us that we are at code red for humanity. The UN Secretary General spoke recently to say alarm bells are deafening, greenhouse gas emissions are choking our planet and putting billions of people at immediate risk. So we face a climate emergency, but we also face a biodiversity emergency. Just yesterday, the US government's Fish and Wildlife Service declared 23 species are likely extinct, including the ivory-billed woodpecker, a bird that had commonly previously been widespread in the southeastern US. And for anyone who's an insomniac like myself, who was listening during the night to the BBC World Service, you might have heard a really haunting recording of the song of the woodpecker, which is now only possible to be heard as a recording because we can no longer hear that bird. And that, to me, really struck home. Indeed, the reports are that the scientists from the service who were making the declaration became quite emotional when they described the impact of climate and of climate change, of human behaviour on other species in our world. So there is an urgency, there is a real urgency, and it's the sort of urgency that characterised governments' responses around the world to the COVID emergency, and yet we don't see that sort of radical response being a characteristic of governments around the world. Governments must take the lead on this. What we've learned from COVID is that to tackle a crisis like COVID, like an international pandemic, we need to see strong state action, strong governmental action. And indeed, if there's any positive to be taken from the pandemic, it has showcased the value of state intervention, of the collective solidarity and of the public good. And I think we're seeing that sense of the importance of the state and of public service in recent results in Germany, where we see the Social Democratic Party winning, in Norway, and we now have 3 Scandinavian countries with a Social Democratic Prime Minister for the first time since 2001. And we see it in the US under Joe Biden and his $1.9 trillion stimulus package. A consciousness, therefore, a growing consciousness of the need for strong government interventions and cooperation. And I think we all very much hope that will be evident in the intergovernmental talks in COP26 at the end of October. We see a recognition of this also in the Citizens' Assembly recommendations, Minister, which provide us with a manifesto as to how we tackle climate change nationally. And indeed, 100% of the citizens in that assembly recommended that the state should take a leadership role and that the state must address climate change through a range of measures, and that this must be at the centre of policy making in Ireland for all governmental departments. So that's crucial that we follow that blueprint and that we take that approach. And indeed, in May 2019, we became the second country to declare a climate emergency. Following that historic development, Minister, I know you warned that declaring an emergency means absolutely nothing unless there is action to back it up, which means the government having to do things they don't want to do. Wise words, and we now know action is indeed needed. And I very much welcome, and my party welcomed, the recent passage of the updated Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act. Indeed, this legislation built on previous bills. I should say that in 2007, as a newly elected senator, I introduced the first climate action bill before the Houses in collaboration with Friends of the Earth. But we're conscious, I think all of us, that these pieces of legislation are governance frameworks, but not ends in themselves. And we need to see strong and robust climate action plan coupled with a strong and robust national development plan to ensure that the necessary actions are taken to meet our climate obligations. On the Climate Action Plan, I think we're all conscious that the Climate Action Delivery Board, which is responsible for delivering the plan, does involve all government departments. But the question I have, Minister, is whether it's adequately integrated into the Department of the Taoiseach and whether there's sufficient leadership from the centre of government and indeed from the Taoiseach on what must be done. Because we know from what goes into the climate action plans that a cross-departmental strategy must happen. And just to give some examples, we're asking the government to work with us on our own Labour NSAI carbon labelling bill to place an obligation on the National Standards Authority to define a standard approach to carbon labelling. Similarly, in the other House, Senator Rowan has introduced a company's emission reporting bill 2021 to oblige companies with more than 50 employees to present the Minister for Enterprise with an audited statement of their emissions, similar to that obligation on gender pay gap legislation. These legislative interventions or initiatives do not fall within the scope of the Department of Environment, but are sorely needed to place additional responsibilities on private sector. And this illustrates the need for a joined-up approach to involve all departments. Similarly, with the National Development Plan, we must see an all-of-government approach led from the centre. We need an energy plan to ensure we're in a position to avail of our huge national advantages in terms of wind and current power, and offshore wind must urgently be developed. On agriculture, we must ensure that agricultural strategy fits within and aligns with climate strategy, and the government must support sustainable activity in farming. And we have really strong examples of how that can be done. One project I visited and been very impressed by for over a lengthy period of time is the Burren Bio project, Minister. I know you're aware of it, in County Clare, in the Burren, led by Brendan Dunford, and that's a really admirable example of how collaborative work between farmers and environmentalists can lead to really strong outcomes for all. So it's in our national interest to be leaders on climate. Just as we've led on progressive change with our marriage equality referendum in 2015, with our vote on repeal of the 8th Amendment in 2018, so too in Ireland can we be seen to lead on taking radical action to tackle the climate emergency. But we need to build on the common purpose and the solidarity that have got us through the last year and a half in order to take this drastic and meaningful climate action. And there are numerous concerns regarding our capacity to take this sort of radical action. So just to name a few, recently reported delays to the rolling out of public transport infrastructure projects in Dublin. There's no clarity, Minister, on the future of Metrolink, and yet projects like Metrolink are essential in order for us to ensure a sufficient move away from private car transport and towards greater reliance on public transport. The expansion of national road networks while parts of the country are underserviced by public transport, and the lack of an updated national policy on the development of data centres, which I know we debated yesterday. Similarly, I think there's a lack of urgency at EU level to pass the necessary regulation, which really should come from a transnational level, on data centres and on fracking and other points. The incapacity of government to guarantee there will be no blackouts during winter, and to ensure that there will be sufficient construction workers to carry out an ambitious retrofitting programme alongside the necessary house building programme that we're seeing. And I should say I was proud to be at Pearse Street yesterday at St Andrews Resource Centre for the launch of a new employment programme to include a training programme in retrofitting to retrain and reskill local people in retrofitting, and that's the sort of local action we need to take. So the situation we find ourselves in is overwhelming, but it all is not lost, and we should recall the message of hope. The IPCC report does tell us that with meaningful and radical action, we can do more than halt the current trajectory. We can also reverse it. And so we need to see really meaningful action being taken. On the circular economy, which Minister Smith spoke about, we need to see really strong measures on right to repair, such as the measure that President Biden introduced in the US, to go beyond current EU directives on right to repair, to extend a right to repair to smaller household devices and to consumers. On local issues around cycling and public transport, I've called, Minister, for the introduction of a bike to school scheme to give incentives for the purchase of bicycles for children to complement the bike to work scheme. Just here in Leinster House, we've had a conversation about parking and car parking for former and current members, but it's raining outside today. Those of us who cycled in still have nowhere sheltered to park our bikes, and I've been lobbying for this, Minister. I know you've supported me, as have other ministers, but we still have nowhere to park bikes under shelter on the Leinster House campus. We see cars parked everywhere. We don't see any adequate facility for the parking of bicycles. And that, while it may sound trivial, sends out a really significant message to everyone about how we prioritise transport facilities. And I'm calling, as convener of the all-party Oireachtas Cyclist Group, for really strong, visible action to support and promote cycling as an alternative means of transport here in Leinster House as much as across the country. And I know you've spoken about Dún Laoghaire and how strong the measures that have been taken there are to promote cycling. That's really welcome, and I hope we'll see a lot more of that across Dublin and across the country to encourage and promote cycling. The very fact, Minister, that global warming is the result of human activity does imply that there's a solution at hand, and that the means of addressing the climate emergency can be embraced by all of us, and that this can be done. Because I think sometimes to be too doom-laden switches people off. It can actually have a counterproductive effect if people feel there is no hope. And I think Greta Thunberg and other really fantastic activists from younger generations really urgently need us to promote a message of hope and a can-do message about the sort of measures that can be taken locally, nationally and internationally to address the climate crisis. I know you understand that, Minister, as does your party, and we in Labour will work constructively with you from opposition, but we need to see more urgent radical action on this.
Jackie Cow, Shea Glen Omid.